let Carlyn do her thing. Thank you for coming in, Carlyn.
Okay, nice to meet you all that I haven't met before. So yeah, my name is Carlyn. I did my undergrad kinesiology degree at U of C in exercise physiology. During that time I was coaching in high school club with some college teams. I played club growing up, played a couple of years in university, and then I had a really bad injury. I've got a pretty rad scar on the back of my elbow here that eventually pulled me out of the sport. So I'm no stranger to injuries in volleyball myself. And then through my kinesis degree and coaching, I got involved in the strength and conditioning side of things. So as Jim was saying, these are the organizations I am working for right now. So I've been working with Volleyball Canada for our Youth Athletic Development Program and BCCE for the past 5 or 6 years. So I'm involved with them on the national level. I've coached with the Youth National Girls team and the Youth National Boys Development Program, working with them to solve this problem of how can we have way more kids participating now, how can we keep them healthy, having fun, and you know, training properly and raising the level of the sport, and then how do we help coaches and athletes on both sides of that, and then health practitioners do all of that. I've been working with Volleyball Alberta for about same thing, about 4 or 5 years, developing warm-up programs, strength training programs. We're now giving kids prep programs before they show up to provincial camps. And then, yeah, I've done a lot of work with Canuck and Dinos, and then recently started with Ambrose this year. With Dinos, I'm the men's strength coach, so we get to go play a game tonight. And I've been working with them for about, again, 5 years. I was doing clinical work before that, working in the hospitals and with more rehabilitative populations. On the other side of things, where I was working with people, ex-athletes, 40s, 50s, 60s, rehabbing, dealing with osteoarthritis, multiple knee surgeries. So I was seeing this huge problem at the later years, and I was like, hey, how can we go back to the youth level where a lot of this starts and get going? So I ended up working with Kerry McDonald out of U of C and with the club volleyball. He was doing his PhD in injury prevention research, and all of a sudden he somehow tricked me into grad school, and that's what I'm doing right now. So I'm back doing a master's in injury prevention. I work for the Sport Injury Prevention Center at the University of Calgary, and we work in a lot of different areas. So soccer, volleyball, basketball, ice hockey. We're a big concussion lab. That's a huge area. A lot of people, my colleagues, are researching. And this is the project I'm currently working on for my master's thesis, which my supervisor and I are hoping is done in July. I'm looking at jump load in basketball. So my job is to look at this is a big giant study I'm a part of, and I'm looking at load monitoring and injury risk in basketball, and we're looking at baseline testing measures, jump load, training load in that sport with youth. What's really interesting for me about combining those two worlds is we have a lot of athletes at the youth level especially that cross over between the two sports. So I'm fortunate enough, what Joe was talking about with the load monitoring, I'll get into it a little bit more later, is using the VERT device. So it's that little thing there. If you've been to the Art of Coaching clinic, they presented that, but we're now able to live time on the field, on the court, track every single jump a player does, how high it is, how many they're getting. And that's some of the data I'm going to be going over with you today, because this is brand new stuff that we really think is going to be starting to change how we're coaching and prescribing training. For you as coaches, I would argue, and this is also working with Carrie and with all the coaches I work with, you coaches are some of the biggest contributors to us keeping athletes healthy. And so for me as a strength coach, often I'll come in and consult and look at, you know, what are training schedules like, what's your warm-up program like, what's happening on the strength side. There's a lot of moving pieces. And, you know, when Jim asked me to do this topic, I'm like, I could do a weekend session of just this area. So again, because my expertise is more in the jump load research and in some of the strength training side of things, that's more what I will focus on. But like I said, there's a lot of work going on. And the reason why in the youth population, so our lab is an IOC lab focusing in youth only, is because we see in this junior high and high school range is when suddenly we see a huge amount of increase in injuries. So for example, the kids are starting to go through their growth spurts, right? A huge challenge as a coach is you have kids at different developmental stages, different skill levels. You have the toughest job, and that's what we're hoping to help simplify and give you some different tools that you can use that might help you in a situation with an athlete. Again, so a lot of them, the injuries that are sort of like not too bad, junior high, they'll start to crop up, but especially in the high school age. And again, developmentally, all those kids are they're a lot different than when they're in elementary school. So we know with those injuries, we see, again, those long-term consequences that I have seen in working with the osteoarthritis population. Those kids can become more sedentary. We can see decreased fitness. So from a public health burden standpoint, it is an issue. Now, why is there not so much research in volleyball yet? It's because we're not one of the top participation sports yet, especially in Canada. So that's something that very fortunately Volleyball Canada and Volleyball Alberta have been working extremely hard over the past few years to get more funding, to create more collaborative networks, to start building up the research in this area, and working with coaches, doctors, physios, other allied sports psychologists, obviously like Sky, nutritionists, and trying to build our resources up in that area. So the other thing too is when we look at injuries, a lot of times sports are looking at severe acute injuries, so like completely blowing a knee out. Again, volleyball, those severe injuries are not necessarily our biggest issue. Most of ours are actually overuse injuries, which if we look at the methodology of how we capture injuries, we don't capture the overuse injuries. And that's what most athletes are actually dealing with. And so we're learning more about how does that overuse injury make them more susceptible to an acute injury? How do those training load patterns work? But that's why, again, it can be a little bit hard to figure out what's going on. Where we do have really good information is in soccer, and we've done a lot of stuff with coaches. And so this is what's interesting for us when we go out to do our injury prevention workshops and deliver that to coaches, is that a large proportion of coaches don't even think injuries can be prevented. A lot of them accept that as a part of the sport. Now, like I said, having sessions like this on, okay, what can we do to prevent that? That's showing a change in mindset over the past few years. And even my experience in working with varsity, it was expected. So with the Dinos, they carried a huge roster with at least 4 to 5 extra guys because they expected 8 to be injured or to be missing 5 or 6 at a time. That was the expectation. Scholarship money, that makes it way more expensive. You're now having, like I said, your roster is having to be larger because you need more bodies to deal with what's happening. What's happened in the 5 years since, our roster is now in 18 or 19 versus 23 when I started. We went from 8 or 9 guys staying off, or 7 not being in full participation, to now most of our team, we have maybe 1 or 2 that we're working on rehab with. If they are getting injured, they're coming back faster. So we are starting to figure out to know what's working. The interesting thing though is watching the change in mindset, that lots of players don't think that, especially in the youth population, they just expect that, that's a part of sport. And it definitely is, but they don't realize the amount of things that we can do to mitigate that risk or reduce their chances of injury. The other thing too, myth busting and injury prevention, is that coaches believe stretching is the primary way that we just stop injury. And now we actually know it's quite the opposite. It's looking more at stability, developing good motor control, and that's where we get a lot of results and kind of bang for our buck. So with injury prevention research, when we look at, okay, where can we find these answers to build the durability in these athletes, we need to figure out what's the problem, which issues are we dealing with, what are the mechanisms of injuries. We introduce the measures and then we see how it worked, rinse and repeat. So this is what I'm working on with Volleyball Alberta right now, is each year we're slowly changing a couple of things at a time and then tracking our injuries and see what happened. And why they originally came to me was the same thing. They go to provincial camps, half the girls by day 3 are off sitting on the side, not able to do very much. They're running back and forth to the hospital all the time with the kids. So that's why I said that's obviously a frustrating experience for the kids and the coaches in our development program long term. That's not where we wanted to be headed. So I'll just bring attention to Volleyball Alberta. Most of you should know about it, the Building Durable Athletes Sport Injury Tracking Project. That's an amazing way for us to start to better understand some of the issues, because traditionally, this is after being in an injury lab for a few years, most of the studies out there are not very good because the injury reporting is poor. So when you're able to participate in some of these programs, it helps us make better decisions in the guidelines we develop, and then, like I said, figuring out what the actual problems are, because the climate of the youth training environment has changed quite a bit in the last 5 and 10 years from when I grew up, for sure. I'm walking into training sessions with athletes that I'm like, I never had knee pain, I never had like some of the stuff they're dealing with. So we're trying to figure out what's going on. The other thing that's going to be coming up just for this, as a heads up for nationals this year, our lab is going to be looking at doing injury surveillance data collection. And we're also going to be having surveys for you coaches there that is going to be asking about what sort of information you're looking for from us. So from the research perspective, we definitely, have a lot of interest that we're looking at. But as a coach, I know in my lab with the researchers, because I went back after 10 years of working, what I was interested in and what the research side was interested in wasn't the same. And we're trying to bridge that gap between coaches and researchers to better communicate and figure out, hey, what are some good topics that are actually going to help you, rather than these complicated numbers that you may not be able to do anything with. So what I want you to think about when we look at injuries for athletes, think about your car. I'm going to take my car out on a road trip to Edmonton in the minus 40 degrees and it's icy. How I prepare for that trip is going to be different than my trip driving there in the summer. Am I going to take my old beat up car on that road? Am I going to maybe try and find a bigger vehicle with more stability? With your athletes, you're having 12, 14 different types of cars show up to you. And that doesn't necessarily predict that they're going to get injured, but again, with the right situation or climate or environment, there's different things that can happen. So we have our predisposed athletes, so there's things we cannot do anything about. Their age, sex, body composition, where they're showing up to us at their physical fitness level, their skill level, and then what Sky was talking about in the last session, the psychological factors. So that's the whole laundry list. That's why it makes this job a little bit complicated sometimes. And so again, that's the area where when we look at things like how can we improve the physical fitness of an athlete, how can we mentally prepare them better, all of those things are going to go in there. And that's where the challenge as a coach is, and the art of coaching comes in, is which ones am I maybe focusing on for that age group or for that specific athlete? What's that weakest link for them? So with that athlete, so again, there's sports factors, there's our coaching rules, our protective equipment, so ankle braces, sports equipment, what shoes are they wearing? That's the first question a sports med doc will ask the kid if they come in with especially a lower body injury. Did you just change your shoes? Are you wearing basketball shoes in volleyball? And that's a fight I go through with the UC guys quite a bit, is wearing the correct type of shoe for the sport they're playing.
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
If we had a girl like on our team just shopping for new shoes and they asked what we'd recommend, like what should we recommend?
You want a court shoe that's built for volleyball. So there's the Asics and the Mizunos, and like I said, just going to some of the more volleyball specific stores is going to be your best bet, because
There's Sport Check and there's like the running. And then
yeah. You would look for one of the court shoes, but it wouldn't be necessarily, like I said, the basketball one. And you'll see why once we get to some of the jump numbers. The needs in movement between the two is massively different.
What gets confusing now, though, is the court shoe could look like a basketball shoe, but it's still going as a court shoe, so you gotta watch that.
Yeah, like a lot of the
Higher cut.
Yeah, they'll have the higher cut ones. There's some volleyball shoes that are higher cut. So, and honestly, most athletes, we actually end up looking online and checking out what some of the different brands are, or what the difference is between, the higher cut ones. I even just look on for Canuck stuff or straight volleyball sites and see which brands there. So, but like I said, some of those companies, they're the ones taking the information from the research for volleyball in the development of those shoes. Now, at the end of the day, some kids might just be really used to a certain type, and then you need to be careful introducing that new shoe in. But I would look for, like I said, get them looking online first at what those volleyball specific ones are, and sometimes they just might need to order them online for what they actually need. Like I said, or go to one of those volleyball specific companies that has all of that, because they do a lot of work looking into what is probably going to be the best for them. So like I said, the protective equipment, so there's a lot of stuff about ankle braces as well too. I said some of this environment stuff we're not going to necessarily get into today, but like I said, that's different exposures that we'll look at. And then there can be, with a susceptible athlete, an inciting event. So a playing situation, I land on someone's foot, I'm diving into the bleachers, someone else comes under the net. U18, we lost our starting setter because a player came way under the net last year. And then, if there's any major biomechanical issues, so again, same thing, it's when things are usually going wrong, they're hitting way off, shoulders are off, landing on a single leg, they're trying to slow down in a way that they're not necessarily used to. So with, like I said, that injury model, and the thing that makes this challenging is that it's constantly changing. So anytime, as I said, we look at injury prevention and building durabilities of athletes, we have to know that they're also changing too. So a couple of examples, so at Ambrose, our girls team, all of a sudden their warm-up, they did all last semester. Their AT emails me yesterday and is like, they're all getting shoulder pain doing the exercises that they did all the first part of the season, and they were totally fine. And so something either in their training volume might have changed, we don't know, but right away, okay, we're adjusting and making that change. Can I just say why that is exactly? I don't know, but we're trying to, like I said, adjust that for when we see those symptoms coming up.
You might get this, so on that, if it's something you can study, but I've had many times where a kid comes to me before practice and says, I hurt myself, or my knee hurts, and you'll ask how did it happen and what happened. Is there any other assessment that you could do? Like sometimes they say, I don't know. So you have kids just say, I don't know how I hurt myself, but it really hurts. Could be going pains or whatever, but how do you assess that?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And because as the coach, one of the other things we're studying is, do kids actually, how many of them are coming up to tell their coach? Some are afraid to and just train through it. Some will come and tell you and want to modify. And so what do I do in that situation? Because even me as a strength coach, I've specialized in injuries. I'm not a clinician. I'm not going to diagnose. My first thing is to try to get them to get that assessed by whether a physio can assess them for more overuse type injuries. So when you're looking at, was it an acute injury or was it more of an overuse one? And so I'll move to some slides and then I'll answer that question a little bit more about who I would go see at those times. So, they're right on top. Okay, so with the acute injuries, in Calgary now, there's some acute sports injury clinics. So what that means is I rolled my ankle and then now it's kind of hurting after. Okay, or I was in gym class, the kids come to you and, okay, I've hurt myself doing whatever else, and I've showed up to practice now and I hurt myself in gym class. And like you said, asking questions to just try and figure out what that is. Your best chance to, if it doesn't seem too bad, is to watch them in warm up and see what they're favoring and if there's any issue. But if you like I said, some of those red flags is that they've had popping, they're swelling, they're not able to weight bear, they're really you can see they're in pain, I'd pull them from practice immediately. If it's like, oh, I'm just a bit stiff and those kind of things, those are ones more likely to be related to overuse, and that's where physio is probably the place to be sending them. But yeah, so in Calgary, at least there's innovative health, and so it's an acute sport injury clinic you can self-refer into online, and it's 2 sports med doctors and a team from U of C actually that were a part of our lab originally. They have started that, so you can get in without a doctor referral. Traditionally, sports med, you would need a physician referral and then need to go to sports med. You can get right into sports med doctors there as well. WinSport is also the other place where you can get right in. So like I said, getting that diagnosis first is probably one of the best things you can do. As a strength coach, one of my biggest struggles is that I don't have that diagnosis of what's happening, and then we're guessing all the time, and it just delays us dealing with the injury properly and giving them the right tools to rehab back if there's an issue. So let's say where you're probably most likely to see that acute injury, ankle sprains, right? So that's going to be depending on the age group and the gender, 15 up to 60%. We see a lot of the thumb and finger sprains, blocking, and then knee sprains, meniscus tears. In girls, we're looking at ACL injuries. Now the overuse injuries, so out of all volleyball players, you're gonna, for knees, anywhere from 30 to 50% of athletes on a team can be experiencing knee pain at one time. And this is where my area of research focuses on, because it's such a big problem, and there's so many different, do they have Osgood's, do they have patellofemoral syndrome, is it patellar tendinopathy, those sort of things. That's where we can get a little bit muddled in what's going on. Yes?
What was that first case you said you could go with the sports?
It's innovative, and it's actually just in Mayfair, and then they have a Deep South location too. And then also at Winsport, they have an... there's 2 locations for innovative, and you can self-refer online. So the athlete can just fill out a report. Within 1 to 3 days, they will see a sports med doctor and an athletic therapist. And now if it's more of an overuse injury like this, if it's a new overuse injury, so that injury has showed up within the last 5 or 6 weeks, they will be able to actually access the acute injury, even though it's probably an overuse one. So we're talking, so when you ask about, okay, well, they just started noticing, like, my knees are aching. And if they're like, oh, my knees are aching, that would be considered the overuse injury. And a lot of athletes, so Team Alberta this summer, I think I sat and explained to them, multiple athletes, no, like, your overuse injury is an injury. The achy knees isn't normal. Achy back pain is not, and not even not normal, but that's not where we want you to be. We want you to be pain-free, right? But pain is a bit normalized in a lot of their settings. And so we're trying to teach them that, hey, the earlier you tell us about this stuff and it's a safe environment for you to come to us about it, then we can start addressing issues with the training load, or maybe get you into a physio or the doctor right away, and get the correct diagnosis for what that might be. And especially, like I said, even with the overuse injuries, a lot of times we might miss that or avoid it a little bit just because they can play through it. And preliminary research we did, it was in youth basketball. In this summer, we studied club basketball. All of our athletes with the patellar tendinopathy, so the overuse injury of the knee, they were still with severe tendinopathy jumping more than the rest of their teammates. So they didn't change their training. And our physios were coming out and checking them, and these kids were in pain. Their rate of perceived exertion per session was higher, so they were feeling physically more tired and finding it harder, but they were not stopping training, and they were not pulling themselves out of it in that situation. So, and again, by then, now we're dealing with trying to be reactive instead of necessarily proactive. And so that's the thing is with these ones, so like I said, knees, that's where a lot of the interventions have also focused on. The good thing about stuff in training for knees is it can actually quite help with the shoulder issues and lower back, because we're looking at core function. So with the knee injuries, your better jumpers, your better athletes are probably going to have the knee issues because of 2 reasons. Their contractile force in the quads is going to be a lot stronger on that acceleration, and their muscle mass and strength may not actually match that efficient system and ability. The other thing is, the higher I'm jumping, the higher I'm landing from. So the amount of force I'm putting on every landing is now much more than every other athlete. Other things are like body weight. So every extra pound an athlete has, that's 4 more pounds on their knees. So for example, in varsity, a challenge I've had is putting weight on athletes that show up, pretty thin, without them getting knee pain coming into the main season. And we've learned some lessons that way too, because it's like, oh, I put 20 pounds on and you're coming in and jumping a ton in practice, then that's going to put them at a big risk. The other thing is reduced dorsiflexion, so that's in the ankle. So the ability of their, so if their ankles are really stiff, they'll have a lot of knee flexion, and that'll put a ton of shearing force on the knee. And so basically the less that they're using their hips and their ankles, so like this kind of landing versus a little bit of a softer landing, it's a huge difference in the force between the two. And then also their dynamic balance or moving balance, which we'll see when athletes they're like landing on one leg, those single leg situations, that's where you're gonna see a lot of those like ACL injuries, especially in girls. And in guys, sometimes those ankle sprains from that. The other thing, like so we talk about with injuries is just some of the concussions. So, and this is a hot topic a bit right now, but I said volleyball doesn't have the highest rates of concussion, but it's something we need to pay attention to. And so again, looking at the ball to head concussion, head to floor, and then some of them it's in player to player. You'll see in club players that player to player chance of concussion is quite a lot higher than in varsity. Okay, because the kids don't necessarily maybe know where they are positionally. They're both going for the same ball. We had this happen in club where with the player-to-player contact. I've seen all of these happen, unfortunately, at some point. And so that's why with Volleyball Alberta, they've got they're introducing the new concussion protocols and policies. It's because we're learning more about, okay, what are the situations these are happening in, and what can we do something to, again, that safety of the player is really important. And so the other thing just to highlight about this is that most of the concussions are actually happening in warm-up or practice. It's not necessarily in the controlled environment. Now, my acute injuries of knee and ankle sprains, it's the flip. Those ones tend to happen more in competition with the higher intensity and practice. So again, people in warm-up, right, not necessarily paying attention and where the ball's getting hit, that's where I said a lot of those are happening. So like I said, when we look at that athlete, we're looking at their skill, their capacity, mobility, stability, and health. There's also these issues of modernization. So looking at how athletes are recovering. So like I said, there's sleep, stress, diet, training. What I really encourage you to do, because again, I want to focus more on some of the movement stuff today, is go look up Life of an Athlete. It's with John Underwood, and he's a researcher out of the United States that's really working. He works with the Olympic Committee in the US out of Lake Placid and all over. He's doing a ton of research into all of this stuff and how it affects athletes. I've implemented tons of his things into our work with our varsity teams. And so he looks at, okay, so if you're really interested in that physiology side, and this is where I like to talk, because this is what my degree was in, is, okay, what's my central nervous system readiness and all of that sort of stuff? What is the effect of poor diet and sleep? Especially, what's happening with the social drugs in the kids, some of those social issues. That's where I get all of my information from for a lot of these things. And then ultimately with injury, we're looking at, okay, well, what are we having too much volume and intensity? Are we training too hard? Are they sick? What's their lifestyle? Are they ready? So with these athletes with the central nervous system, so volleyball is a power sport, right? So our central nervous system is my brain talking to the muscles. If I'm tired, I am way more at risk for injury. And that central nervous system fatigue may not actually present itself right away unless you're seeing, oh, that kid's missing a ton of serves today and they don't normally. Their toss is way off today. They just, they seem slower. As coaches, you guys are actually probably the best at recognizing central nervous system fatigue that is different than muscular. So they may not physically feel tired, but they're just a little bit off. And a little example is one of our, we had a player in the first semester at UC get injured after he had not been sleeping for a few days, huge stress with some school stuff, had some other personal things in his life going on, practiced really well, went out within like maybe half an hour of our first game on the Friday, hurt himself really badly in a landing accident that he would normally have run out of, right? And so then everyone's like, oh, well, he didn't do this, this, or this. And I'm like, well, this kid was under a ton of stress, like the whole week he was exhausted. Does that predict he's for sure gonna get injured? No. we can't predict for sure someone's going to get injured, right? You have these kids that have the worst, like everything. They eat terrible. We have a fifth-year athlete that's the worst eater ever. He doesn't, like, he does sort of some of the stuff we ask, and he's fine. Like, he just sort of gets away with it, right? You know, for now, knock on wood, okay, it's gonna be fine tonight. So, but yeah, so it's, like I said, there's those different levels. So with those kids though, what you're looking at is for volleyball, okay, how ready is my central nervous system? Now with kids right now, okay, this is my brain activity when I'm reading. This is when they're on their phones. So they're coming on their phones all day or maybe on computers. So you're having kids show up with already a little bit of a drain on the central nervous system. So one of the things that we've done, and again, you can look in that life of the athlete, is looking at how we're adjusting that. So we'll say no cell phones, you know, half an hour before practice. Video games is a huge thing. We're dealing with playing games on their phone. They want to play on the whole bus ride, traveling. They're on Snapchat, they're texting, everything, right? So we limit before game time for sure. If it's someone that's always on their phone, that's someone we have a conversation with about that. No cell phones, minimum 30 to 90 minutes before bed, and getting them off that screen time. If you go on the Life of an Athlete website, there's actually a whole manual. It's the Sleep and Performance Manual. It talks about how this stuff affects their sleep. It talks about multiple factors affecting sleep and central nervous system readiness. Yeah.
What effect does it actually have? What is the impact on the athlete? Because this came up in my parent meeting just last week.
Yeah.
Parent asked me, do you allow cell phones during the term?
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, I don't want to take cell phones. Like, kids nowadays, they're on their phones all the time. They're connecting with other teammates. They want to see the pictures of themselves on Instagram that just happened the match before.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just how they are. Half your, they're sitting together. They stay together the whole time.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are looking at their phones.
Yeah.
So if I were to take those phones away during that term, I mean, there'd be a little bit of an impact, or I'd be pretty upset, maybe engage a little more, but what am I saving them from if I were to do that? What's the advantage?
Yeah, so what you're having basically is so like I said, this is our brain drain on this. So we're saving them from basically a 2/3 extra drain on their central nervous system. And so when you look at reaction times, if they're using their phone quite a bit before, and say they're on their phone most of the day, their reaction time will go down from, so we want it to be about 1 or something. It'll go to more like a 0.3, which is quite a bit in reaction times.
1.3, is this a percentage or is this
It's in seconds, milliseconds. So I have some other slides for that specifically, but not in this presentation. But basically what a lot of the research has shown for especially sleeping is that it affects your melatonin and the blue light, so it throws their sleeping pattern off. And then when we're looking, like I said, at that brain drain, so you are using, your visual cortex is using a lot of your brain energy throughout the day, and there's a max time for that reading and on the phone time, and we're looking at 8 to 10 hours is what that should be. So if they're at school all day and then they're on their phone a few extra hours a day, which for most kids it can be 10 to 15 hours, that's going to be quite a bit.
So that kind of, it's not from 0.1 to 0.3 every time you engage with the phone, but that's
No.
throughout the day.
Yeah, it's cumulative.
The average, term, we're looking at about 8 hours in the gym,
Yeah.
right? We're going to play city 6 matches,
Yeah.
right? So it's going to add up. So by the end, you get into the playoff situation, you're going to be that much slower.
Yeah. And the thing that's interesting about that question is that they're starting to research it more even in youth, what the effect of it is, because we know their nervous system is more susceptible to, like a lot of their injuries are because of nervous system issues, so balance and fatigue from a neuromuscular standpoint. And so to quantify it exactly in, say, like a youth and volleyball, that hasn't been done yet. That would be an amazing study. But what they'll see is that cumulative effect of that whole day that starts to cause some of those issues. And especially, but also it's just that focus, right? So it's, again, doing your pregame prep. So a lot of that pregame prep will take that 15, 20, 30 minutes.
If you do decide to go that route and say,
Yeah.
what you guys do, and of course, adults understand differently than 14-year-olds.
Oh yeah.
But if you explain to them not so much as the drain on the CNS, but throughout the day, eye strain, hunched over, right before the game, instead of maybe standing up, right, interacting, playing, hand games, maybe stretching for that half hour rather than being on your phone, would that be a way to maybe get them to accept that?
Totally. And a good way I talk to kids about it, it's battery percentage. So on their phone. So I say, if we want to be at 80% or higher, and we're constantly taking 5% here, 5% there. And for each kid, it might be a little different, right? Because again, like I said, we have our thing where it's like, okay, they've got, all these different factors going in. And again, depending on, this is just talking about their brain maturation, but they're still developing too. But I'll say, if we're trying to recharge your batteries right now, this is what we need to do. So we actually even don't, with UC, I don't think they even noticed, to be honest. We probably took their phones away a bit because we gave them a different routine for prep. And it was like, but some of them were bringing cell phones into yoga, to recovery. And like, they'd be like, I would physically take them away them. And same thing with our club teams. So it was just rules in certain training environments. Like, it's just not there because that's a distraction even. But then we just focused on the positives, which is, okay, what do I need to do to prep to get ready? And being on Instagram is not helping me get ready for volleyball. Yeah.
At the younger age groups where they may not necessarily care about this, would you, I'm thinking of just saying.
Performance. Do you want to jump higher? Do you want to be able to move quicker on the court? This is what we need to do.
You're just encouraging socialization.
Totally. Yeah. And that's where you can look at, some of those, talk to the person in front of you. Not like, if you're interested enough, maybe I'll look up from my phone. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that I've noticed it with my own kids. If I get them off their phones or their games or whatever, they play hockey better. Even if they're outside being active, using up energy, they play better than if they sat there on their phones or anything.
Yeah, and like I said, that's where the research in this area is really interesting, and it's every month there's new stuff coming out, is seeing the effect of this internet and phone stuff on our brains. There's a book called The Shallows that talks about what the internet's doing to our brain. Yeah, some people have read it. Yeah, so it's like I said, it's talking about all that, and especially, like I said, when we're looking at the developing brains, it's really interesting to see where a lot of this is going to be headed. Now, the other thing, like I talked about just briefly in that analogy, is that stress level. So, okay, back to kind of your question is, well, how much is their phone gonna, do I want to make that a stressful event, taking that away from them? No, because their brain, now, what Sky was talking about is, managing anxiety, is that we're also, the more stressed out we are, and a bit more high strung, that's going to waste a lot of that brain energy, and then it's, again, distracting from my focus. It's going to change how I'm moving versus moving a little more freely. So with some of them too, if it's a stress that I'm waiting for a phone call or I need to find someone, I'm not going to take their phone away in that situation.
It might be stressful for them not to have it, but I've been somebody that goes on call once a month.
Yeah.
As soon as that phone rings when I'm on call, I'm stressed. So
Yeah.
if the kids are hearing their phones ringing and they're maybe having a bad chat date or something with somebody, and they hear that beep again, that might stress them out even more than just removing them from that environment.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, to quantify how much they're on their phones all day, it's really challenging to do. This is the recovery manual I was talking about. So that's something as a team or an individual basis, you may want to adjust, but it's something to think about. Okay, and it's something, like I said, that we have research to support it, and also with the athletes, we've noticed there is evidence now supporting that it does have an effect on their reaction times. So I think it's it slows the reaction times, I'm trying to remember the numbers now, 3.2% or something. It can be 3.2 to 6% for lateral speed, front speed 5%. That's how much they're starting to get slowed down with too much of that. So like I said, with all those things, okay, now we have different things going on with those athletes. So with Team Alberta Volleyball, we're looking at how can we incorporate injury prevention into some of our training environments. And what we're seeing is these individuals, they can be all over the place. That's the thing as coaches is, okay, there's certain stuff I'm going to do as a team. There's certain things that generally, maybe for middles, this might work better, or setters, or this position. And then there's our injured athletes that we do have to individually modify. They have a shoulder injury, we're yanking them out of drills. And we know when we look at workload, there's optimal zones where I have good performance, low injuries, team fitness. But there's also these training zones and sweet spots. But then when I suddenly have a huge spike or a huge decrease in training, that's basically what I'm looking at for injury risk. So it's not even high training volumes we're finding that's the issue, it's how we're getting there. So are we slowly increasing that to allow tendons, muscles, ligaments to adapt? Are we all over the place with what we're doing in practice? How have we built them? So your first session, one of the first sessions this morning, I think, was discussing that training plan programming. This is something I'll work with coaches on a fair bit when I have the opportunity. I did a lot with Brock this summer for the boys especially, was their practice planning because we had their jump numbers to figure out what drills were causing spikes, how much, we were going from 2 or 3 sessions a week. Okay, let's go up to 4. And so that's what I'm working with Volleyball Alberta to figure out for even Team Alberta scheduling is how do we build them into this good zone without having huge spikes, but it's also preparing them for competition. And then we know that changes in training, if we can stay within 5-10%, we mitigate a lot of that training load issue. And then if we have 15-20% changes, then we're starting to see issues. So if I don't have enough training load, I'm in trouble. De-adaptation, or if I have way too much, okay, then and we don't get a break, then we see chronic fatigue. But the only strategy of just being, okay, we'll just stop everything is actually not the best solution most of the time. It's looking at how do we modify or get them, within a bandwidth that we can be training in. So again, back to those knee injuries, what we've been looking at with Team Alberta this summer was jump load, so jump frequency and jump count. So we use the vert. And it's got a 97% accuracy, so that means it captures pretty much every single jump that's happening on the court. And it gives us this readout. It shows us all the different jump numbers for each player. So what's neat about this is, and this is actually pretty typical of what you would see in a practice, is the numbers are all over the place. So based on the position, based on if a kid gets stuck in a drill, they can be jumping quite different. Their heights can be different. And this is where we're looking at seeing, okay, what can we do to modify workload, what's actually happening out there? And then for me as a strength coach, this information totally changed how I programmed. So this is a team thing in one of our practices. So I want you to guess what position would these, so 150 to 85 jumps be? Pardon me? Setter, yeah. Okay, so our setters were jumping on basic, and this is very consistent, is double, right? Intuitively it makes sense, right? And this is actually a low practice for them. We'll go over some other numbers that would show a bit higher. So they're doing all these jumps, repetitive jumps. What about the next range, maybe like 70s to 90s? It's a trick question. This case, it was the middles, but it can be a power or a middle. It'll depend. Your faster middles are probably going to be jumping more. And then our lowest one, pardon me? Yeah. So their average jump height is there. The highest jump they did is 1 inch is there. And then, like I said, what we're looking at is the percentage of like how many they were doing over 20. So this is in boys. So girls you'll see more in their averages will be closer to 15 to 17 or so. But their jump counts are actually quite similar between the two. Anywhere from 16 to 18. Yeah, so we had a pretty good mix. So what we were looking at is that, okay, this is how many jumps that they're sometimes seeing. Now, when I started in varsity and then at the full-time training center, we're looking at 500 times a day. So and jumping is a really good way for us to quantify workload in volleyball. Now, what's the most important movement pattern then? If I'm jumping, is my squat, right? So working on that is a huge area where we look at refining the technique, jumping and landing technique. When I saw these numbers, I was like, and in varsity, we see slightly different, we see even more difference with specialization, which is really neat because I changed all their off-season training programs. And then even now for youth, we don't see as much variation because they'll tend to rotate through different positions, which is great. Like we want to develop that athlete, but just so we have an idea, okay, this is where it can be. Now, and again, you look at a tournament load, whoa, we're building them up to several hundred jumps and landing impacts every single day. So we need to work them up to that, right? Because they're going to face that training load. But again, like I said, the thing is to look at is, okay, if, you know, I'm doing a lot of, even the jump float serves, that's a large amount of jump load. So people won't think about it, but that actually puts, because of the horizontal translation, that's a lot of force on the landing with them. So that's your jump float serves. You'll see 3 peaks in the data where their serve is, their block, and then their spike. So when we look at the height data a little bit more closely, we'll see that. So this was our middles. So this is a sample of 1 week, and look at the variation between the 3. Now, the middle one was injured or had an overuse injury flare up after like day 2. So his volume right away was, we reduced it and really watched him. But then that's in a week of training at Team Alberta of 2 a day. So their team did 10,000 jumps as a team in a week. So it's a lot. And then again, setters. So now look, my setters jumps are 1,300. So again, variation, but they're double, right? And again, it's that sub-max jump. Our left sides, so again, huge variation. We had a difference in physical capacity and age between the ones in the 400s that, again, were shut down a little bit more, and then our left sides. So yeah, it's kind of neat to see this because we've never, in youth populations, there's no information like this anywhere for what that training load is. Same, our right sides were pretty similar to our outsides kind of in the middle, and they were similar to each other. So now this is an athlete I was tracking through school volleyball this year. So again, so we looked at those jumps in a week with the Team Alberta training. Obviously it's higher volume in that setting, but if we look in the school volleyball, what I'm going through is his data on what happened over the club season, over the school season, and then we're following a few athletes through club. But again, looking at those changes, when I talk about those spikes, okay, this person's knees flared up after a 170% spike in training volume from week 1 to week 2. So, and that's a higher volume trainer, a player. So again, we're at the point right now where we're getting this data and we're just kind of watching some of those trends. So what we look at is some of the neuromuscular training strategies and components. This is something that is really helpful for developing the movement patterns, making sure that so like I said, when you're looking at for your athletes, okay, how much am I focusing on their squat pattern, their proper warm-up and activation, and that jumping and landing? That's one of the most important things you could focus on. With the warm-up program that we have developed with Team Alberta, it's, like I said, it's more focusing on the components, and like I said, often I have a sample I'll give you guys today that you can look through of what we're talking about for proper prep, but some of that neuromuscular training can actually be done as that strength training. So we're looking at that aerobic training, dynamic stretching, agility, and balance. So when we look at these, we look at the quality of their movements. So I spend most of my time teaching athletes from all those numbers now how to jump and land. Okay, because like I said, we're looking at these numbers now and we're seeing, whoa, this is what we're trying to prepare them for. We're a ways before getting a good handle on some of the load monitoring, other than being like, okay, well, if I have 3 sessions a week. Now if I had a 4 session, I'm probably increasing risk a bit, but how am I, like I said, how am I building up that intensity? And a lot of you guys will have that good, like I said, a good handle on that. So what you want to focus on now is, like I said, what we do know which works is the neuromuscular training. So it's, has anyone heard of the FIFA 11 Plus in soccer? Okay, so this was a program, a neuromuscular training program developed in soccer to reduce ankle and knee injuries. And this is where a lot of the research is being done. We're starting to do work in basketball in a version of this. And again, what they'll see from some of these neuromuscular training programs, which is when I talk about neuromuscular training, I'm looking at, okay, can I do like lunge and rotation without knee caving in? Can I do hip activation, glute activation? Am I developing torso and core strength? That's what neuromuscular training is. Am I working on, like I said, their jumping and landing techniques? And like I said, warm-up's a great time, blocking warm-up. I'm so strict on athletes in blocking warm-up and hitting warm-up on their landings. We'll do prep work of sub-maximal jumps and then soft landing, watching, especially with a lot of the kids, lots of them, their knees will cave in and those kind of things and that movement quality. With neuromuscular training in acute injuries, we see a 40 to 70% reduction in acute injuries. We're now studying the effectiveness of this in overuse injuries. And like I said, that training load piece is going to be a huge part of it. But that's, again, where what you're doing in that prep time you're spending and then what you have your team doing outside of it. So some of these neuromuscular exercises is awesome homework for them. Yeah.
So with your research, did you also look at the history of the athletes in the sense that they're 2-sport athletes, or if they're just one sport and they've just done volleyball otherwise, or if they've done volleyball and hockey during certain cycles and or
Yeah.
volleyball, soccer, volleyball, other things, and if that helps them stay away from injuries, or if it escalates things?
A lot of the current research supports multi-sport athletes having reduced risk of injury, and it's coming out more frequently. So when now where
certain sports that are good complements of each other,
it's just more that they're not overdoing it in one sport for the entire year. So I would say whatever sport that kid loves is probably the best way to go. But if they get a variety of movement patterns, and so that's with the neuromuscular training. So again, we're looking at teaching them how to side lunge and decelerate correctly. And those kind of things. Well, if they're only exposed to one sport's movement pattern, so swimming is a really great example, all the overuse from just like front, whatever the stroke is, but they don't have any like back work really, right? Exposing them to even just more back exercises helps with that, or a land sport. So it's that well-roundedness, and you're basically, it's like downloading apps on the phone. You get way more apps, you can do some cool stuff. And at the varsity level, I've seen some of our best athletes were multi-sport all the way up, and they're just like creative with what they were able to do. It's because they had more hardware. And also they're not overusing the same muscle contraction type and movement pattern. And there's a lot of, now beach volleyball is, yes, there's like a lot of similarity, but there's also a huge amount of difference in the need to movement, even though it's still volleyball, that I have seen athletes successfully be able to do both, as long as, again, they're getting some times off as well. But yeah, I just encourage them, that they're not only doing the one sport and specializing, even if they're in, grade 10 and 11 still. Grade 12 might be a little bit of a different story for the end of it, but yeah. So what I wanted to do, just before we leave, so I have some copies of the neuromuscular training sample warm-up and some of the injury prevention exercises our physio at U of C. She worked with the Golden Bears for 5 years. So she's put together. And then just to give you guys an idea of what we're working on. And so with Volleyball Alberta, with the neuromuscular training, we're hopefully going to be having some videos. I know some eventually. And yeah. So it's one of each of
Are
the,
they two separate?
they're two separate ones.
Starting. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Starting there.
There you go. So do you want me to just give you both? So what you'll see with these programs, it's looking at some basic mobility. So the areas where we'll have issues with athletes is thoracic spine and back mobility. How do I properly warm the spine up? How do I warm up my open rotation and movement? How do I activate my glutes after staying on the phones and doing like this all day? I encourage you to try doing these, because as a coach, we're all like sitting in our desks all day, and it's a great way for us to stay healthier and loosen up. But we talk about loosening up through the hips, getting correct muscle activation for our squat patterns, and then how do I piece that together? So like I said, when we look at the components for the neuromuscular training, what I'll typically see when I go out to watch practices or games, and especially in club, is that usually balance is missing from the warm-up, some kind of balance component, which is, like I said, for those ankle sprains and that ankle injury, and then also really helping with knee. And then some of the strength work, like the torso activation with doing some planks, doing some of the hip work, and then with the agility, it's looking at movement quality. So, use with the warm-ups, we usually build athletes into those, and we might pick a few exercises at a time before they're doing the whole thing, because it can be quite a bit, but we'll pick aspects from some of that movement training and try and go from there. And so, because they're doing some kind of warm-up anyways, but doing too much stretching and that sort of stuff isn't stabilizing them and helping them prep for that activity. And because with this age group, their stability is the biggest risk factor, the more we can get them in control of their bodies with good posture and, like I said, with equal strength between the front and the back, then that's going to make a huge difference to help balance their body out. So it's sort of a recipe with different age groups or different, some of the different teams or different situations you might have based on space and location. You're going to need to adapt what you're doing, but it's just it's intended to sort of get you thinking about, okay, what are we looking at that we know is evidence-based for the injury prevention, and what do we know works for sure right now in reducing those injuries, and then but how are you going to implement that, and what are some things that you can do? So maybe you have a great routine already where you're doing a lot of those great things. Okay, now maybe I'm going to change one or two. What Sky talked about, if you were here at his lecture, was that mental engagement and warm-up. With our athletes, we often have to progress and change and challenge them, and that progression of an exercise, so taking them from, okay, if I'm doing, a front plank to a front plank with a leg lift, now suddenly they're having to work a bit harder. They're not going to be talking if they're trying to think about what they're doing. So when they're starting to chat through warm-up, I know it's too easy, and I change it and I give them the next version.
What about those, like, not necessarily the ones that are on the court, but the ones that are waiting? Kind of like, they're friends, so they're chicken chatting and stuff like that. Is that
Before?
not directly on the court, participating in the drill, but waiting to come into the drill?
Oh, okay. Like for just in regular practice?
Like a regular drill, you're doing something on the court, and then as soon as you pass it, the next person comes in, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's sometimes about giving them a certain focus for the drill. Like, so if they're outside of that, okay, are you, like what are those one or two things you're focused or thinking about? And yeah, like you said, is there that way to engage them? Now, say I have an injured athlete that is hanging out and people are trying to go to them, I'd busy them with some of this stuff. Our injured athletes always are like talking away to someone else, and I'm like, no, you're going to work on your rehab now. Like, it's great you're here, but you have a job to do here too. So you can still come to practice, you can still do some of this stuff, do your rehab, but you're here to contribute either, like even just, okay, I get them to coach each other. That's the other thing with this, with the athletes. I teach them to train each other through the exercises and the alignment, and they'll tattle on someone if they're doing it wrong or they're skipping out, and you have your leaders on the team either lead the warm-up, and I'll usually get athletes to show up 15 minutes before the actual court time to do the initial mobility and activation. And what they'll be able to do then is get focused. Everyone's there early. During some of that stuff they can chat, but when we get on court, now we're focused on our movement patterns for that and going through it that way. Yeah, so it's, but yeah, I know what you mean. It's like they get off to the side and
They're just waiting and,
yeah.
10 seconds to have a brief conversation with someone that they know. So.
Yeah, well, and sometimes that's, you know, am I giving more feedback in the drill? What am I watching for in the other players, or what's happening there, right? So it's giving them that focus for engagement for whatever that might be. And so same thing in blocking, I might partner them up and be like, hey, you watch his block jumps, or you watch her block jumps, and you try and coach them and give them feedback. And that also empowers the athletes to help coach each other a little bit, and you teaching helps you make a better learner as well. So yeah.